So some of you may remember when Digibro had his freak out over JoJo Part 5 winning Best Character Design at the Anime Awards a few months ago, as he believed that the designs for Part 5 were unbearably ugly. And I kind of agree. These designs are really not good, even for JoJo. JoJo's designs are usually kind of janky in one way or the other, but it never bothered me that much until Part 5. So why is that? To understand why, we have to look at a broad overview of how JoJo's character designs have changed over the years, both in the manga and the anime, as well as the staff involved in creating those designs. Starting at the beginning, Phantom Blood and Battle Tendency's character designs are easy enough to understand, with this being the era of manly men doing manly things, a la Fist of the North Star. JoJo's early character designs fell right in line with that aesthetic. Jonathan, Joseph, and most of their fighting companions are big buff dudes with lots of muscle. However, these designs aren't all that complex. Heavily detailed, but not necessarily complex. The complexity came mostly from their shading and more realistic facial features, so it didn't appear to be too much of a strain from a design standpoint when it came to translating those designs to the medium of anime. Additionally, most of the clothing in the anime is significantly scaled back in complexity in comparison to the manga, but still retains the aesthetics of its respective era, so not much is lost in translation. Of course, it also helps to have a character designer who is both a veteran at her craft and a specialist in what the work calls for, and Takako Shimizu fits the bill almost perfectly, having done key animation for countless series and worked as a character designer for a Fist of the North Star film, so it's no surprise that translating the designs from manga to anime appears to have been a smooth process. It's also important to take the idea of exaggeration into account. These massive lumps of muscle aren't meant to look buff in a realistic sense. Much like anime titties, anime muscles are often exaggerated to the greatest extent possible, simply for pure visual spectacle, especially in works from the 80s and 90s. And early JoJo nails that almost perfectly without sacrificing too much when it comes to actual animation. Part 3 is where we start to see a mild shift in Araki's design philosophy. While the likes of Jotaro and the others still retain the manly man basis that was prevalent in the previous two parts, the designs also become much more complex. Hairstyles get wilder and clothing becomes more intricate and detailed. Along with the hard edges that make up many of these characters' facial features, these designs are more difficult to translate to animation than the previous designs had been. On top of that, we also have to deal with the addition of stands, whose designs are significantly more complex than their human counterparts. So what then was the solution? Well, for that, we fall back on the idea of exaggeration I mentioned earlier. Rather than trying to soften up certain areas of their designs to make them more flexible, the Part 3 anime almost seems to amplify the core traits of these designs. Outlines are emphasized, muscles stay bulging, and heavy shading is used frequently to exaggerate a character's emotions. Granted, this does come at a cost, as a good portion of the series feels extremely stiff and rigid when it comes to movement. However, the base impact of the designs remains strong enough to overcome this most of the time. It might not be a very fluid series with much movement to it, but it gets the job done by playing to its strengths rather than trying to rework its weaknesses. And then we come to Part 4, which is probably the most important era of JoJo to look at when it comes to character designs. Unlike the previous and following parts where the general design sense stays consistent from beginning to end, Part 4 stands out as a transitional period for Araki's designs. It starts off with the buffer, more angular designs that we're used to from Part 3, but by the end the designs have become much smoother and appear to have adopted a sort of Bishonen aesthetic. Put simply, the characters are much prettier at the end of Part 4 than they are at the beginning. While this kind of transition is fine for a manga published over the course of 3.5 years, to do the same for a 3-core anime would be too noticeable. Plus, it would put more strain on the animation team as they'd have to relearn how to draw the characters every episode. To avoid these pitfalls, the production team decided to go with the later designs for the entire series. While this could be a bit of a shock to anime-only viewers coming off of Part 3, I think it was ultimately the best decision in the long run because the sleeker and more beautified designs just feel better than the more angular ones for the way JoJo was being written at that point, as though this is what Araki had in mind for Part 4 from the beginning. So what does this mean for the anime adaptation? On the one hand, the characters are much less bulky and rigid, so the designs are naturally prettier. On the other hand, the designs are still just as complex and detailed, if not more, so the character designer had to decide how much detail to leave in so the characters could be animated easily without simplifying them too much. For that task, we turn to Terumi Nishi, who I think was the perfect choice for this project. With Part 4 having some of the most complex emotional narratives up to that point, the anime needed to have characters that were flexible enough to fully draw out all of those emotions. Their features also needed to be a bit more subtle, so rounding out the designs and softening up those features makes a lot of sense. At the same time, these designs are still extremely detailed and needed to be tweaked somehow so that they could work in animation rather than just a still manga panel. So getting someone with significant experience working on Precure was a stroke of genius. Being able to draw cute girls dolled up in complex and detailed magical girl outfits while still having them be able to move around and fight, along with decades of key animation experience on a bunch of other titles, gives Nishi a unique edge when it comes to creating designs that are complex yet flexible. And while there are a few things that I'm still on the fence about with these designs, her contributions to the overall design of Part 4 made it an incredibly enjoyable experience. Speaking of which, this is also a great place to branch off into another key discussion point: color design. JoJo's color design is a difficult beast to tackle simply because said design can change at the drop of a hat in order to elevate the intensity of a given scene, and I adore this part of JoJo's aesthetic because it plays so well into the bizarre nature of the series. However, there is something to be said about the base color design. Outside of these color inversions, JoJo's color design for parts 1 through 3 is relatively normal. Whatever fits the scene naturally is what they go with, occasionally exaggerating certain colors to achieve some sort of cinematic aim. In regards to the character design, color is actually fairly simple. Most of the clothing the characters wear is either dark in color or bright in a way that doesn't draw an excessive amount of attention to itself. Part 4 is where this starts to change a bit, with the outfits being imbued with a stronger sense of style and flair than before. However, because the overall color design of Part 4 also goes for a stronger sense of style, such as the yellow skies highlighting the eerie vibe that has settled on the town of Morio, the colors of the outfits don't feel so out of place. With all of that in mind, we come back to the issue of Part 5, and why the character designs for its anime adaptation are so much weaker than previous parts. Much like the end of Part 4, Part 5 continues the trend of the designs having a sense of beauty to them. This time, however, there is no transitional period. The muscle-bound giants are nowhere to be seen, and the slimmer, sexier designs have been brought to the forefront. Even their clothing seems to accentuate their sex appeal by having patches of skin showing in unusual places. At the same time, the designs are still just as complex as Part 4's, with ornate colors and crazy hairstyles. So this adaptation needed to be able to draw out the beauty of these characters while also making them flexible enough to move around. And unfortunately, it failed at both of these. Rather than follow in the footsteps of Part 4, it instead reverts back to the philosophy of Part 3 and amplifies as many details of the designs as possible. This causes many of their features, especially facial features, to become more exaggerated and bulky, the exact opposite of what needed to be done for them to look beautiful. If these characters were still big buff dudes, then this might have worked, but they're not. They're smaller and more slender, so amplifying their features is only going to make them look uglier instead of more beautiful. This also brings back the issue of having too many details to animate, thus making movement more of an issue. So that sense of stillness that was only a mild problem in Part 3 is readily apparent here. There are also a few red flags that pop up on the staff end of things. Takahiro Kishida certainly isn't someone to sneeze at when it comes to being a character designer. Baccano, Durarara, and Haikyuu seem to be the general wheelhouse of his design sense, and all of those anime have fantastic character designs. And he also provided the anime versions of designs from other artists for shows like Madoka Magica and Serial Experiments Lain. He even did key animation for the original Stardust Crusaders OVA, so he also has a history of working on JoJo. This guy usually knows what he's doing. However, I think what happened here was simply a poor choice of talent placement. Kishida is definitely a great character designer, but most of the designs that he works with tend to be fairly simple from the get-go. There's nothing overly complex about the designs of Hinata Shoyo or Lad Russo, and so his ability to produce a sleek and flexible character design works well in those instances. As far as I can tell, he doesn't have much experience working with more complex designs like those of JoJo. Madoka's the most complex he's done before this, and that's still pretty simple. Taking the extravagant details of Part 5's designs and simplifying them into something that works in animation doesn't appear to be the norm for Kishida. So what we ended up with was the manga's character designs pasted onto the anime without any detail removal, thus making it more difficult to execute each shot. It's also important to note that Kishida is only the character designer, whereas Shimizu and Nishi were also the chief animation directors for the parts that they worked on. There was more overall control at play with their works, whereas Kishida simply provided the designs for the animation staff to work off of. Part 5's color design is pretty wonky as well when it comes to clothing. Because style is being cranked up more and more as JoJo progresses, the colors for the clothing become brighter and stand out more. In Part 4, this was mitigated by making the environment color design a bit more abstract and complementary to the colors of the clothing. In Part 5, they use a more standard coloration for the environments, which simply doesn't complement the color design of the characters, thus making the characters stand out even more in a less appealing way. Now, in fairness, Part 5 isn't completely ugly in all areas. In fact, certain elements, such as the cinematography and camera movement, are the most complex and well executed from any part so far, thus making the action scenes where this type of movement is used much more exhilarating. The designs for the stands are also really solid, though this is probably because they were handled by someone else, Takahito Katayama, who was also the action animation director, thus giving him more control over how his designs are used. And despite the background art not working well in regards to complementing the character designs, those backgrounds are still incredibly gorgeous. There are a lot of strong elements to Part 5's overall design sense. Unfortunately, these elements don't exist separately from each other. Every part has to work for the whole to work, and because the character designs failed so horribly, it has a cascading effect on the rest of the show. In the end, Part 5's overall art direction came out looking incredibly messy despite having several strong elements, because those elements simply couldn't mesh together in the right ways. And I hope that if/when Part 6 is eventually brought to animation, the production team will be more thorough in making sure that the designs are retooled properly for this shift in medium. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourke Tenjoin, Christine Seibert, Call Me Catlord, Ryan Johnson, Eugenio Mendoza, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.